Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It has been some time since I want to welcome you to today's program on the 18th day of August in the year 2019, and it is a pleasure to be here in communication with you at the Virtual Center on the Head On Radio Network. I thank you so very much for your willingness to give us a portion of your day. I know how valuable time is. More and more studies are beginning to show that more and more of us identify time as the most valuable commodity that we have. And so I basically appreciate so much your willingness to devote a portion of your day, a portion of your time, and to other programs on the Head On Radio Network. I think various times, and we the idea of keeping this opportunity, this voice out there, and I can't emphasize how important I believe that is, and I want to again thank you for your willingness to tune in today. Let me also share with you our phone number and invite you to participate actively in the program by giving us a call at 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you would like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is WAOBrien, IEN, 906 at gmail.com. That's WAOBrien 906 at gmail.com. In our last time together, we began the process of looking much more substantively at Garry Wills's analysis of the Federalist Papers, more specifically his book entitled Explaining America, the focus on the Federalist Papers. And we spent, as you know, quite a bit of time on Wills's study of the Declaration of Independence and of Jefferson in his Inventing America. And so it stands to reason that there's going to be connections between the two books, and and clearly a major connection between the two is going to be the emphasis on Scottish philosophy, on the so-called Scottish Enlightenment. And we had talked in a previous program, actually, some time ago, unfortunately, but we had talked about the organization of Wills's book, the fact that it is divided into 4 parts. They are approximately of equal length. The first 2 parts deal with Hamilton and Madison, who are the principal authors of the Federalist Papers. Part 1 is entitled The Hamiltonian Madison. Its intent, from Garry Wills's perspective, is to try to suggest that while there are major distinctions oftentimes put forward between Hamilton and Madison, philosophical differences, the fact of the matter is, what Wills is pointing out is there's an awful lot of Hamilton in Madison, but also there's quite a bit of Madison and Hamilton as well. And so the general conclusion that one reaches after reading the first 2 parts of Wills's book Explaining America, which takes you close to the first 100 pages of the book, up to page 93 to be exact, you begin to get a sense that while there are distinctions between the two, philosophical differences, if you will, between the two, obviously, given the history to follow the Constitution between these two men, it's very obvious, because in the 90s, as we know, Madison lined up with Jefferson and the emergence of the Republican Party in the 1790s, which ultimately gets Jefferson elected president in the so-called Revolution of 1800. And there's no question that the group of Federalists, headed principally by Alexander Hamilton, is the principal basis upon which the Jeffersonian opposition forms or coalesces, principally in opposition to Hamilton's foreign policy, which is pro-British, as it was, I think we've already seen in Hamilton's very famous speech to the convention on June 18th, but also in terms of his domestic policies, which are built around his so-called financial program, which is delivered at Congress's request early in the Washington administration in 1790, 1791. So there were obvious philosophical differences between Madison and Hamilton. But as far as ratification of the Constitution is concerned, the differences on both parts are set aside in order to undertake the monumental enterprise which we know as the Federalist Papers. John Jay wrote about 5 or 6 of the Federalist Papers. All the rest of them were written by either Hamilton or Madison. Obviously, most of them by Hamilton, because remember, this is an effort that takes place in New York in order to secure ratification in the state of New York. Hamilton, as well as John Jay, is based in New York, so it stands to reason that this whole initiative from the beginning is pretty much Hamilton's baby, so to speak. But we also know that Madison wrote some of the key papers. So what we did, where we were last time we were together, is to begin looking at a bit of a contrast, if you will, between the two, similarities and differences, if you will, between Madison and Hamilton. And there are a number of directions that we can go in this. I've selected a couple that I think are particularly significant. One is the influence, no question, the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment on the thinking, principally, of James Madison. Part of that goes back to his education. I'd like to deal a little bit with this because I have, I really believe that this is significant. And as many of us know, Madison left Virginia to go to college and attended Princeton University. And at the time, in the 18th century, Princeton consisted of one building. The Princeton University consisted of one building, which is named Nassau Hall. In a number of conferences that I've attended at Princeton in recent years, Nassau Hall is now a hotel and conference center. In Madison's time, it was Princeton University. And knowing that fact, and knowing that that I spent on 3 or 4 different occasions, I spent 2 or 3 days in the same hallways, walking the same hallways, and being in the same rooms as James Madison is kind of unnerving for me, because I have a tremendous respect for Madison and what Madison was able to accomplish. But what I really wanted to share with you is a statement. This is a quotation from Douglas Adair, who has done an incredible amount of work on James Madison. And in his book called the Founder's Search for Fame, if you will. And Adair has a statement in his book that I really wanted to share with you because I think it addresses the significance of the Scottish Enlightenment on the founding. And this is a quote directly from Douglas Adair. At Princeton, at William and Mary, at Pennsylvania, at Yale, at King's, which is Columbia, and at Harvard, the young men who rode off to war in 1776 had been trained in the texts of Scottish social science. Princeton, for example, where 9 members of the Constitutional Convention of 1787 graduated, was a provincial carbon copy under President Witherspoon of Edinburgh. The emphasis I wanted to make here was the fact that 9 members of the Constitutional Convention graduated from Princeton. I don't think that that's something that people are that aware of. The great names, Adair says, in this sudden flowering of the Scottish intellect are David Hume, Francis Hutcheson, Adam Smith, Thomas Reid, Lord Kames, K-A-M-E-S, and Adam Ferguson. Their books formed the core of the moral philosophy course at Princeton. And it was in these works, treating of history, ethics, politics, economics, psychology, and jurisprudence, always from the modern and enlightened point of view, that Madison received his very early and strong impressions in favor of liberty, both civil and religious, unquote. I wanted to speak just for a few moments today, just to share with you some thoughts on this, because I reread this weekend a very, very critical review of Gary Wills's book, Explaining America, by Marvin Myers, who's a very, very competent historian. Marvin Myers is considered to be one of the foremost authorities on the Jackson period in American history. But early on in the 70s, in the 1970s, excuse me, in the 1970s, Myers also put together, edited, a collection of papers, essays, and philosophical position papers on James Madison. So Myers is considered a Madison scholar. And his treatment of Gary Wills is pretty devastating. And I reread his review this past weekend. The principal criticism that Marvin Myers has of Gary Wills is that he believes Gary Wills is overemphasizing this connection to the Scottish Enlightenment. In Explaining America, for example, every one of the chapters in Wills's book, every chapter opens with a quote, most every chapter, with a quote from David Hume. I take that back, every chapter. I'm thumbing through the book right now just to make sure. I couldn't believe it was every chapter, but it is. So the implication clearly is that the connection between James Madison, the Federalist Papers, and David Hume is absolutely totally linked together. It is not to be challenged. Marvin Myers is concerned because he believes that Gary Wills is really going overboard in order to make this connection between David Hume and James Madison. The source for a lot of this connection is Douglas Adair. We talked a little bit in a program a few weeks back about Douglas Adair. He was a historian of this period. Douglas Adair took his own life in 1968. He's considered to be one of the most insightful, brilliant minds to ever study this period. Unfortunately, at a rather young age, Douglas Adair took his own life. But in his collection of essays, Douglas Adair makes the link between David Hume and James Madison, most specifically in relation to Federalist Number 10. And if you look at Gary Wills's book, you will notice that he dedicates this book to Douglas Adair. And I think that's very significant because he makes a comment at the very beginning when he makes the dedication to Douglas Adair. He basically he dedicates his book to Douglas Adair because he says Douglas Adair was one of the few people who, well, this is the way he says it. It met to the memory of Douglas Adair who saw it first. And basically he is dedicating this book to Douglas Adair because Douglas Adair was the first prominent scholar to make the connection between the Federalists and David Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment. I think there's obviously some question because it's really hard to measure or to substantiate the extent to which someone's ideas or thinking is influenced by someone else. It's very, very difficult. I think Adair goes to great lengths in his essay on Federalist Number 10. Actually, it's a two-part essay on Federalist Number 10 to make the connection between Madison and David Hume, which is incontrovertible to me. I can't believe that anybody would even question the extent to which Madison's ideas, many of them, especially in federal, stem directly from David Hume. The idea of the enlarged sphere, of increasing the size of the territory in order to increase the number of factions and all the rest of it is straight out of David Hume. And the reason I wanted to comment on this is because while it is very difficult to assess the extent to which any of us are influenced by other people, there are certain things that are beyond, certain realities that it seemed to me are beyond question. For example, this is just elements of James Madison's background. At the age of 12, Madison attended school at a school taught with a fellow scholar named Donald Robertson. They both studied together under Robert Innes. Robert Innes, the tutor, was a product of the Scottish Enlightenment. He was educated at Aberdeen in Edinburgh. He came to America 6 years before William Small, whom you will recall was Jefferson's tutor at William and Mary, was Jefferson's instructor at William and Mary. Robertson's Academy included James Madison, who studied there for 5 years, from the time he was 12 until the time he was 17 years old. He studied at an institution whose whole modus operandi was related to the Scottish Enlightenment. Not only that, I apologize for the phone in the background. But when he went to Princeton, the head of Princeton, the president of Princeton University when Madison attended, was Witherspoon. And Witherspoon also was a product of the Scottish Enlightenment. And in Witherspoon's lectures on moral philosophy, which he published in 1800, no author is mentioned more frequently in Witherspoon's lectures on moral philosophy than Francis Hutcheson, who was really the driving force of the Scottish Enlightenment. There's absolutely no question that from the time he was 12 years old, Madison's whole academic life was mired in the writings and the philosophical meanderings of Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. I think Gary Wills is right. There's no way that you can be steeped in a particular philosophical attitude toward events and not be influenced by that kind of background, especially from the time you're 12 all the way up through graduation from Princeton University. This is the best example that I can give for what I believe is a point of view which pretty much validates some of the assertions, some of the links that Gary Wills is making with the Scottish Enlightenment. When I graduated from college, I was 25 years old. I didn't go directly to college out of high school. I worked for 3 years. So I didn't start college until I was almost 21 years old. I was 20 years old when I started college, and I graduated in 4 years, and I believe I was 25 when I graduated. At that point, I went to graduate school. And I've said this many times before, but the point, I think, this is a different spin on that same story. I was in graduate school privileged to study under the tutelage of Merrill Jensen, who was in the late 20th century was considered to be one of the foremost progressive historians in the country. I studied from 1965 until I left the University of Wisconsin to teach here in southern West Virginia for 6 years. But I was 25 years old, not 12. There's no question, as I think back on it and try to be very, very realistic and objective, there is absolutely no question that the way I look at the founding, the way I look at the Declaration of Independence, the way I look at the Confederation period, the way I look at the Federalist Papers and the Constitution of the United States, is in large part through the eyes of Merrill Jensen. I like to believe that I was an independent thinker. I like to believe that I just didn't buy in to a particular point of view and become the spokesman for it. But over the years, as I've continued to read, especially the primary sources, I have become more and more convinced that Merrill Jensen's reading of the founding was the right one. That doesn't mean that I'm 100% in line with Merrill Jensen's thinking. Let me give you an example where I am not. Douglas Adair. At the time I went to graduate school, which was in the late 1960s, Douglas Adair was was nearing the end of his life. Of course, we didn't know that at the time, but he took his own life in 1968. Douglas Adair was one of the foremost historians of this period. He was considered what at that time was called an intellectual historian. What that meant was that most of Douglas Adair's research and writing was focused on ideas. He was more interested in the philosophies, the philosophical underpinning of the founders. His whole approach to the Constitution, to independence, to the Declaration of Independence, that entire period was focused principally on the ideas, what people read, what people seemed most comfortable with. Looking at the letters written by Madison and Jefferson and Washington and Franklin and John Adams and Abigail, looking at these letters and identifying the origins of the ideas in them. Douglas Adair was convinced in the way he read history that man's behavior is driven, in part at least, by what he believes. So do I. Merrill Jensen did not. Merrill Jensen was in the so-called progressive school. And of course, the biggest name associated with the progressive school is Charles Beard. And we all know Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. The progressive school, as a group, tended to believe that people's behavior was almost exclusively driven by their own self-interest. Consequently, progressive historians focused on the self-interest of the founders, believing that there was a connection between what was in their own self-interest and what they did and what they wrote and what they believed and what they argued. I can remember Merrill Jensen in one of our seminar meetings making the statement about Douglas Adair and others of that. Bernard Bailyn, for example, at Harvard, was another historian in this school. And Jensen made the comment that these people believe that man is driven by ideas. Jensen I can hear him saying that he rejected that. That the only way to really understand history, Jensen believed, was to focus in on the self-interest of the people who lived it. In a sense, you begin to get a feeling, I begin to get the feeling, that progressive historians tended very, very close to the ideas of Marx. Marx believed that all history was driven by economic determinism. That if you understood the economic realities of a particular period, you could understand the period. Progressive historians were kind of in that direction. I'm not necessarily saying that they were Marxists, but they tended to believe that self-interest is the principal motivator of behavior. At the time Merrill Jensen said that, I don't believe I had the background that made it possible for me to necessarily disagree with him. But over the years, as I've read and studied and reflected and on the people who lived it, I've become very, very much convinced that what people believe determines to a tremendous degree how they behave, what they do. I think all you have to do to think about this is think about religion. Is it possible to understand the history of any people, any period, any culture, any nation without considering at least what these people believed? Puritan Massachusetts during the colonial period, for example. If you are not familiar with the ideas of Calvin, of Calvinism, and Calvin's spin on Christianity, in other words, if you're not somewhat familiar with what Puritans believed religiously, then the society they set up in the New World makes no sense. Because they believed that they were on a mission from God to reform the world by their example. They believed that they had a commission from God to set up the perfect society. And they believed that God would reward them for performing that mission well, but alternatively that God would punish them if they did not. So all of the rules, all of the laws that the legislature, the general council, so-called, in colonial Massachusetts established were deemed to be in tune with divine scripture, God's will, the New Testament. These people believed that their entire way of life would flourish or die based on how closely they were able to adhere to God's plan as revealed in Scripture. If you didn't know that, if you are one of these people that believes that religion is a private thing and we don't have a right to get into people's religious beliefs, then you couldn't be a historian. Because so much of what we do is driven by what we believe, by the culture we grow up in. Once I began to appreciate that, I began to take issue with some of Merrill Jensen's criticisms of Bernard Bailyn and Douglas Adair and some of the others. I became fascinated with the world of ideas, the writings of Plato and Aristotle and Julius Caesar and Aquinas and on and on and on. But that does not deny the fact that even though I believe that ideas are extremely important in understanding the past, I have never abandoned the ideas that Jensen taught me as my mentor. And that is the idea of looking for agendas, looking for hidden meaning, reading between the lines, thinking critically, asking questions, not just absorbing information, but questioning it, looking for the motives behind it. And the more I've done this with the founding, the more convinced I've become over the years that there's something to be said for all of this. What is my point here? I don't want you to think I've totally gone off on a different tangent. My point is that in reflecting upon it, I recognize in myself the way I view history, the way I look at the founding, has been influenced in more ways than I can even begin to count by my 6, 7, 8-year association with Professor Merrill Jensen. The way I look at this period, in large part, is the way he looked at it. And the more I've gone to the primary sources, the more I've begun to read the papers and the writings of the Jeffersons and the Madisons and the Washingtons and Adamses and the rest of them, the more convinced I've become that Jensen really knew what he was talking about. Not for 1 minute does it deny the respect that I have for the writings and scholarship of Douglas Adair or Bernard Bailyn or any of them. I've become one of the biggest fans of Gordon Wood, who I believe is probably the greatest living historian of the founding right now. Gordon Wood's book on the radicalism of the American Revolution, which won the Pulitzer Prize, is a book filled with ideas. Gordon Wood talks about republicanism. He talks about the ramifications and implications on what people believed about their world, about themselves, about their future, about raising their children, all of these things being affected by the ingredients of what we call republicanism. And those ideas, tied in as they were with the commitment to popular government, people's right to participate in government, those ideas not only extended throughout the United States as a nation, those ideas pervaded the entire world. And much of what the world has become and where the world has gone in the last 150 or 200 years is directly attributable to what the founders were able to do, to the ideas and the philosophy and the attitudes and the ways of looking at the world that the founders left us. So I believe, again, that it's not just one point of view versus another point of view. I think that in order to get a handle on all of this, it's very important to mention this. Consequently, and this is the point of this whole soliloquy, if you will, I believe that Gary Wills has to be onto something. James Madison was immersed in the writings and the teachings of the Scottish Enlightenment for 7, 8, 10 years of his youth. There's absolutely no way that you could spend 5 years as a tutor, or with a tutor who was educated in the writings and the moral philosophy of the Scottish Enlightenment and not be influenced by it. And then go to Princeton University, whose president, Witherspoon, is one of the most acknowledged students of the Scottish philosophy in the New World. And the entire curriculum of moral philosophy and history at Princeton was made up of the writings of David Hume and Adam Smith and Francis Hutcheson and all of these names associated with the Scottish Enlightenment. So to suggest, as Marvin Myers does, that later in life, in the 1820s, Madison and Jefferson both recommended, if people really wanted to understand the Constitution of the United States, mentioned that they needed to look at the ideas and the writing of John Locke. To Marvin Myers, that fact that Madison himself recommended that students seek to understand the Constitution by looking at the philosophy of John Locke, to take that and assume that that means that all the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment is non-existent, is, I think, going a little bit overboard. So again, I think what we're talking about here is the extent to which how you measure how much influence particular people, particular ideas have on all of us growing up. I think we all know that. Part of our whole education system is oriented towards the idea of exposing young people, maturing young people, to proper ideas and proper values and ethics and morality and all the rest of it. I really believe that this is a significant point. And what my point is that as I look back myself on my own background, there's no way in the world that my reading of the founding, my interpretation of the founding, is not linked directly to the fact that I studied with Merrill Jensen. I would be the first to acknowledge that and to be grateful for it. And there's nothing that I have learned since my days as a graduate student with Merrill Jensen that have caused me to question the validity of that particular interpretation. I think we can do more to add to it. As I mentioned, I've become fascinated with the world of ideas, because I think ideas and behavior are directly connected. But that doesn't mean that it supplants the progressive view of the founding as articulated, I think, but more brilliantly than by anybody, by Merrill Jensen. So, that is kind of the point that that I wanted to open today's program with. We're at 45 minutes after the hour right now. Again, let me share with you again our phone number. It's area code 304-574-8178. I mentioned the Constitutional Convention who graduated from Princeton, and the extent to which Princeton's entire curriculum, Douglas Adair points out, was built upon the writings of Hume and Hutcheson and Adam Smith and Thomas Reed and Adam Ferguson and the rest of them. Adrian Coke is one of the more prominent students of the founding. In her writings, she also makes a major point about the extent to which the Scottish Enlightenment affected the learning atmosphere at Princeton. This is a quote from Adrian Coke. Witherspoon had studied with David Hume, Adam Smith, and Thomas Reed. The Scottish Enlightenment in moral philosophy and social scientific areas, therefore, became a philosophic must for the students at Old Nassau Hall, Princeton. Gary points out, and this one I wrestled with, and I think I'm including this because I think some of you might find this interesting. Many of us are familiar with Jonathan Edwards, the so-called First Great Awakening minister and firebrand preacher, evangelical preacher Jonathan Edwards. And in his dissertation, Edwards credited Francis Hutcheson with having a tremendous influence on his thinking. I had problems with this because those of you who have read, and if you haven't, I encourage you to do that, Jonathan Edwards' sermon entitled In the Hands of an Angry God. Many people will cite this as an example of Jonathan Edwards and of this kind of evangelical thinking. The idea that we're sinners in the hands of an angry God uses the image of a strand, a spider web, and we're on the edge of that web, and we are just hanging over the pits of hell, and at any time that string could break, or God could release it, and we would drop into the fires of hell. And therefore we had to repent. And I had a real issue with that and the link with Francis Hutcheson, because Francis Hutcheson is talking about benevolence and the moral sense and all the rest of it. And I couldn't see the connection between Jonathan Edwards and Francis Hutcheson. But then, upon reflection, I began to see a connection. If you read Jonathan Edwards, his sermons, you can begin to appreciate how much Edwards believed that reaching man's soul was as much through the heart as through the head. While Jonathan Edwards organized or structured his sermons in such a way that they were philosophically and academically solid, the fact of the matter is Jonathan Edwards was an absolute word master in terms of his ability to structure sermons in such a way that they touched hearts. They touched feelings. And in that sense, there's a connection with the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers and with Francis Hutcheson. So again, I really believe that this particular issue is really an important one. I want to kind of make a transition, not a sudden transition here, but I do want to make a transition here, because what I'd like to do is concentrate a little bit more directly on the link between David Hume and James Madison. Because if you read Federalist 10, as Charles Beard or Merrill Jensen would read Federalist 10, or as a Marxist would read Federalist 10, you would begin to find in Madison a view towards man that was quite contradictory to the thinking of David Hume. I'd like to share with you a couple of quotations from David Hume. About the link between what people believe and the behavior that they exude as a result. David Hume says, the 10th Legion of Caesar, talking about Caesar and his legions, his army, the 10th Legion of Caesar and the Regiment of Picardy in France were formed promiscuously from among citizens, but having once entertained a notion that they were the best troops in the service, this very opinion really made them that. What Hume is talking about is the degree to which what we believe affects what we are and how we act. Hume goes on and talks about legislators, representatives, government officials. And he says the following: when a man is prepossessed with a high notion of rank and character in the creation, he will naturally endeavor to act up to it, and will scorn to do a base or vicious action, which might sink him below the figure which he makes in his own imagination, unquote. Let me read that again. Because what Hume is saying is, man tends to try to live up to what he believes he ought to be. His image, his reputation. So consequently, Hume would believe that if you can convince people to be more than they are, better than they are, they will try to live up to that. It's positive reinforcement. It's quite the opposite from penalizing people for being wrong. In other words, this is encouraging people. So let me read this quote again. When a man is prepossessed with a high notion of rank and character, when man is possessed with the idea of being well thought about, high rank, well thought of, and of noble character in the creation, he will naturally endeavor to act up to that. Go on to do a vicious action which might sink him below that figure which he makes his own imagination. In other words, once people aim to be at least a certain level, then they cannot consider doing anything which would show them to be less than that. I'm struck by a wonderful letter written by George Washington at the time of Shays' Rebellion in 1786 in Massachusetts. When Washington heard about Shays' Rebellion, he was absolutely appalled because so much of what Washington was based on the image he had in the community. And so much of that image was driven by his position, the way he dressed, the carriages he rode in, the horses he rode upon. Much of Washington's life was spent living up to the image because his feeling was that the respect that he expected to receive from those in his community who looked up to him demanded that he act that way. And anything less than that would demean his whole image, his whole character. So when he heard about Shays' Rebellion, about people not paying their debts, Washington was mortified because he said in this letter, my God, half the people in this community, in this region, owe me money. What if they decided not to pay me, like these radicals in Massachusetts? If people all of a sudden decided not to pay me what they owed me, I would not be able I could not sustain my image, my standard of living, the quality of life that people expect from me. Their influence, the respect that I have, everything would suffer. Washington was really hung up on the idea of image and the idea that people expected certain things of you, and that was the basis of your power and your influence. And you couldn't afford to do anything to jeopardize that. That's what David Hume is speaking to, is the idea that people will strive to portray or to live the image that they want people to have of them. Here's another statement from David Hume. I may now ask, he says, upon what foundation the prince's title stands. Not on popular consent, surely. For though the people willingly acquiesce in the prince's authority, they never imagine that their consent made him sovereign. They consent because they apprehend him to be already, by birth, their lawful sovereign. Think about this. This is where Hume differs from John Locke. John Locke believes that the power of the sovereign, the power of government, comes from the people, from the rational reasoning of the people in terms of what the people will give it. David Hume is arguing that the reason the people are willing to consent to the power of the prince is because they believe that by birth the prince already is there. The prince has earned that power. Reason has nothing to do with it. It's the idea of what's in your head, what's in your mind. And finally, and this would be the last, we're just at the top. Let me read this quote and we can move into our second hour. This is David Hume rejecting Locke's idea of contract in his treatise on human nature. Lest those arguments should not appear entirely conclusive, as I think they are, I shall have recourse to authority and shall prove from the universal consent of mankind that the obligation of submission to government is not derived from any promise of the subjects, nor need anyone wonder that though I have all along endeavored to my system on pure reason, and have scarce ever cited the judgment even of philosophers or historians on any article, I should now appeal to popular authority and oppose the sentiments of the rabble to any philosophical reasoning. Listen to this. I should now oppose the sentiments of the rabble to any philosophical reasoning. What Hume is saying is it's naive to believe that everybody operates out of pure reason, which is what Locke argues. For, David Hume says, it must be observed that the opinions of men in this case carry with them a peculiar authority and are in a great measure infallible. The distinction of moral good and evil is founded on the pleasure or pain which results from the view of any sentiment or character. And as that pleasure or pain cannot be unknown to the person who feels it, it follows that there is just so much vice or virtue in any character as everyone places in it, and that 'tis impossible in this particular we can ever be mistaken. Basically, what Hume is pointing out is the extent to which one's ideas and self-image determine what they are. It's not pure raw reason and logic and common sense. Man does not function solely around the whole idea of calculating and planning and all the rest of it, which is kind of what Locke suggests with his emphasis on reason. So what David Hume is suggesting is there's something a little bit less defined, more difficult to define than hardcore reason. And it's this idea of image and the idea that people try to live up to what they ought to be and people to see them as. It gets into the nature of a class-based. That's kind of where I'd like to go in our second hour today. It is now 3 minutes after the hour of 2 p.m. in the East. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back for the second hour of today's Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to our second hour today at the Virtual Center. This is Bill O'Brien, and it is a pleasure to be with you. If you've been with us since the beginning of the program today, I want to thank you very much for staying with us. If you are just joining us for our second hour, I thank you for tuning in. I invite you to participate by giving us a call and sharing your ideas and your thoughts on some of these things. Today's conversation, I will admit, is a little bit esoteric. It's a little bit up in the clouds, so to speak, because we're talking about the extent to which self-image and affects behavior. What we think affects what we are, et cetera, et cetera. Little bit tough to get your arms around this stuff, but I will from you. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I'd love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. We were talking a little bit about David Hume principally, and of course where we're going is we're going to try to establish the connection between David Hume and James Madison and as revealed in the Federalist Papers. I just want to share with you a couple of lines, one from Madison and one from David Hume, and then I want to get into what I believe is an important theme and an important concept for the rest of our time together today. If you remember, we looked at Federalist number 49. That's the one at which, in which Madison takes issue with Jefferson's recommendation about conventions and the dangers of a convention and the dangers of inflaming the population, the general population, or the danger of suggesting that government has weaknesses. And so Madison's concern is you're really stirring up a hornet's nest when you do that. If you think back a couple of weeks ago, we dealt pretty extensively with Federalist number 49. But in that Federalist paper, Madison talks about this idea of who we are and where we come from and position and image and all the rest of them. And Madison says the following: their connections of blood, of friendship, and of acquaintance embrace a great portion of the most influential part of the society. Again, he's talking about the legislature, the tremendous advantage that legislatures have over the other branches of government, because these people, it's so extensive and these people are so well connected. And what he's talking about is the status of society from which representatives come. Their connections of blood, of friendship, and of acquaintance embrace a great portion of the most influential part of society. The nature of their public trust implies a personal influence among the people, and that they are more immediately the confidential guardians of the rights and liberties of the people. With these advantages, it can hardly be supposed that the adverse party would have an equal chance for a favorable issue. What Madison is suggesting here are the realities of a society based on peoples of different classes, of different positions. I ask you to think about this in the context of Jefferson's commitment to equality in the Declaration. What Madison is pointing out here is that the representatives need to come from a particular position in society, whose connections with the right people and the most influential part of society makes them proper guardians for the rights and liberties of the people. In other words, the people, Madison is saying, don't want to elect themselves to look out for their own best interests. They seek to elect those who are better than they are to look out for their own best interests. And this gets us into something that I think is very significant, and I think this is where I'd like to go today. Let me pair up that statement of Madison's in Federalist number 49 with this statement by David Hume. By parties from affection, I understand those which are founded on the different attachments of men toward particular families and persons whom they desire to rule over them. This in a society which Jefferson in the Declaration theoretically has committed to the principle of equality. Hume is saying, by parties from affection, I understand those which are founded on the different attachments of men toward particular families and persons whom they desire to rule over them. These factions are often very violent, though I must own it may seem unaccountable that men should attach themselves so strongly to persons with whom they are nowise acquainted, whom perhaps they never saw, and from whom they never received and can never hope for any favor. In other words, what is it about people that causes us to find solace and security in people we look up to? Yet this we often find to be the case, Hume says, and even with men who on other occasions discover no great generosity of spirit, nor are found to be easily transported by friendship beyond their own interests. we are apt to think the relation between us and our sovereign very close and intimate. What Hume is suggesting is the reason people follow the leader is not because of self-interest or hardcore reason, so much as it is because of their belief that the leader is the leader because that leader deserves to be the leader. That this person is born to lead. This person was educated to be a good leader. So in other words, what Hume is talking about and what Madison is talking about is that people want to look up to their betters. In the 17th and 18th century, this idea, for lack of a better term, has been referred to as deference politics. The word defer, when we use the expression to defer to one's betters, to defer decisions to people better equipped to make good decisions. And the extent to which traditional societies were organized this way. This is the way people who belong to the so-called upper class gained that position and kept it because they were able to earn the respect and the affection, the genuine affection of people that they were born and trained to lead. The idea of deference politics. And the reason I mention this is because as we've been talking about the creation of the new American Republic, first in the Articles of Confederation, and then a different approach to republicanism as articulated in the Constitution of the United States. Many people tend to believe that the traditional idea of social structure, of a class system, disappeared, that the emergence of republicanism shattered the traditional view of society as class-based. I want to share with you a paragraph from Gordon Wood's book, Radicalism, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, on republicanism. And I think most of us will be able to relate to this. Gordon Wood says, "True, the intellectuals and critics who invoked Republican principles and sentiments were opposed to the practices and values of the dominant monarchical world. The ideas of republicanism contradicted the traditional practices and the traditional values of the world that existed at that time. But they sought to reform and revitalize their society. They wanted to enlighten and improve monarchy, not to cut off the heads of kings. These critics and many others, including good loyal colonial subjects of His Britannic Majesty, used republicanism merely as a counterculture to monarchy. Though rarely cited specifically by name, republicanism represented all of those beliefs and values that confronted and criticized the abuses of the 18th century monarchical world." And then Wood goes on to talk about the specific ingredients of republicanism. He says, "But republicanism was no less revolutionary for all that. In fact, it was in every way a radical ideology, as radical for the 18th century as Marxism would be for the 19th century. Republicanism challenged the primary assumptions and practices of monarchy, its hierarchy, its inequality, its devotion to kinship, its patriarchy, its patronage, and its dependency." Wood says, republicanism offered new conceptions of the individual, the family, the state, and the individual's relationship to the family, to the state, and to other individuals. Indeed, republicanism offered nothing less than new ways of organizing society. It defied and dissolved the older monarchical connections and presented people with alternative kinds of attachments, new sorts of social relationships. It transformed monarchical culture and prepared the way for the revolutionary upheavals at the end of the 18th century. What Gordon Wood is suggesting here, of course, is that republicanism confronted and contradicted all the traditional assumptions and attitudes about the way society is and ought to be organized. The implication here, and this is what I want to address, the implication here is that with the onset of republicanism in America, the idea of a class system in America disappeared. And we actually began to actively work toward the kind of society in which everybody was considered to be and treated equally. I really want to raise a question here, namely, the extent to which you believe that's true. I would suggest to you that deference politics did not die with the American Revolution or the establishment of the United States Constitution. I would suggest to you, from the way I look at society today, that the idea of deference politics is still very, very important in our society. We still organize our day-to-day lives, so many of us, around the idea of associating with people we look up to. We want our children to associate not with people that they are superior to, but to people that we believe are superior to them. We want our young people to acquire friends that will help them become better people. We want our children to go to the best schools. We want our children to belong to the right organizations. We want our young people to go to the best colleges. We're willing to go into extreme debt in order to make it possible for our children to go to school with people who come from a background well above their own. We believe that it is well worth the price of inflated tuitions to create the opportunity for our kids to rub shoulders, to network with position in life looks like it's going to be guaranteed. We want our young people to make the right connections, the kind of connections that will last them for the rest of their lives. And we're willing for it. We're willing to go into debt in order to pay for it. On the other hand, we are constantly urging our kids, our children, not to do things or not to act in ways which suggest that they are not refined, that they don't have class, or the term that is often used is savoir-faire, knowing what to do, knowing how to do it. We want our kids to be able to interact and be comfortable in social situations quite a bit above where they are now. I can remember in teaching classes and talking about deference, and that's what we're talking about, is the whole idea of deference. I can remember asking students, have you ever been in a social situation where you felt out of pocket, out of place, where you didn't feel like you belonged? Have you ever been invited and you sit down at the table and there's more spoons and forks and knives and wine glasses and water glasses and all of this than you've ever seen in your life? You don't know which fork to use, which spoon to use. You begin to worry about what the dinner is going to be. You're afraid you're going to be served something that you don't know how to eat. And then it's going to be impossible for you to not betray so that everybody would know that you are in a situation which is above your raisin, is the expression that they use here in the mountains. So-and-so is living above his raisin. This whole idea of deference politics, of a deferential society, did not die with republicanism in spite of the arguments that Gordon Wood and others use. I would suggest to you that if you think about it and look around, deference is alive and well in the 21st century USA. How many of us shop for clothes according to the label? How many of us look for sales so that we can buy clothing with the right labels? So that when we take off a sport jacket, for example, and lay it across the back of a chair, we don't mind the label showing if it happens to be London Fog or something of that caliber. Tommy Hilfiger. How much in our society today, how much do we believe what we are to people is based on the image we project? How many of us leave copies of the Wall Street Journal, the London Times, the Times of London, the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Review of Books, laying around on coffee table so that people who visit us will kind of take one look around and say, boy, these people read some pretty good, some really highfalutin stuff. How many businesses have been successful by being able to bring high quality, elite label goods at bargain prices? Why do they sell? Is it because Levi jeans are better than anybody else's jeans? Or is it because there's something about that label that kind of suggests that you fit, you belong, you dress well, you eat well, you comport yourself well? We even have classes on how to walk, for young girls, on how to walk, how to talk. I've seen, for example, I've seen colleges that offer classes in fine dining, so that students will never find themselves in a position where they appear to be above their raisin, so to speak. I can relate from my own experience an example of what I'm talking about. Some years ago, I interviewed for an executive position at a pretty well-known university here in the East. It was the position as executive director of a graduate center, a center affiliated with a university which offered graduate classes. And I was fortunate enough to get an interview. I traveled to the site of the interview. I brought my wife with me. They put us up at a wonderful hotel overlooking the ocean. Wonderful meals, great meals. The next day, my interview began with a one-on-one with the president of the university in his office at 8 a.m. And from then on, I went from office to office and I interviewed all day long different people associated with that university. I knew that there were a number of candidates. I was not the only one. That evening, my wife and I were invited to dinner. And at that dinner were a number of officials from the institution, from the college. Deans and associate deans and division chairs and department chairs and all the rest of it. And it was dinner in one of the finest restaurants. Well, it was in Virginia. I'll tell you that. It was in Norfolk, Virginia. And as we were sitting down preparing for dinner, one of the people associated with the college handed me the wine list and said, "It is our practice when we interview candidates for a position like the executive director's position that we allow the candidate the opportunity to order the wine." Let me be honest and tell you that I never once ordered wine in my whole life. Most of the wine that I was familiar with came in screw-top bottles, not corks. This was clearly a test to see whether, in fact, I was of the right caliber or the right class to get this position. I could have faked it, but that would have been ridiculous. So I respectfully declined. And I believe that in respectively declining the opportunity to order the wine, I respectfully lost my chances of getting that position. I believe. I don't know. I just believe. But ever since then, this happened 30 years ago, I've been obsessed with this idea of deference. This idea of people looking up to their betters. In other words, you don't defer to people unless you believe that these people warrant that such deference and respect. And there's no question that our whole education and cultural systems are organized around efforts to prepare people for these kinds of situations in our society. In terms of today's desperate search for jobs in an economy which is not producing nearly enough meaningful job opportunities, how much of one's success in securing the job is based on qualifications, and how much of it is based on personal characteristics and personal attributes that we really don't even recognize or understand? It's not supposed to be that way, because the United States of America in the 21st century is a society without a class system. Everybody is entitled to equal opportunity. Everybody's middle class, theoretically. But the fact of the matter is, way down deep, we know that the elements of deference remain with us. To what extent does deference affect the decisions that society makes and the laws that societies pass? I would suggest to you all of these things are critically important, and we need to understand that they form a significant part of one's overall consideration if we are to understand the behavior of the past. David Hume is talking about this. James Madison is talking about this in Federalist number 49. The way you get people to obey the laws and the rules of other people is by doing everything you can do to demonstrate that the people making the rules, calling the shots, have a right to be calling them. Whether it's the fact that they have 13 different degrees, framed degrees, hanging on the wall of their office, or it's a fact that they have PhD or something on the door after their name. We are a society that is committed to the principles of equality, but at the same time, we are a society that has never lost the belief that we can talk about equality all we want, but the fact of the matter is we all know that some people are better than other people. It is naive to assume that these things don't exist. It's naive to assume that because of something called the American Revolution, all of this stuff changed. One of the best quotes I ever saw at the time of the American Revolution in the 1770s came from Philadelphia. I believe it actually is a quotation in Gordon Wood's book, but I'm stuck to find the page. But basically, it's an expression of a person in Philadelphia who makes the comment and says, I am seeing, this is right during the turmoil over independence, and this person makes the statement and says, I'm watching people riding around in carriages with lace cuffs who 10 years ago weren't worthy to shine my shoes. Who do they think they are? Do we really believe that the advocates, the founders, wanted to set about creating a society in which everybody was really equal and all the old ideas of deference didn't apply? I don't think so. I don't think so. Think about how much of our behavior today is driven by these ideas of deference. Let's go back into the 19th century prior to the war, and let's look at the issue of slavery. In the 1950s, I believe it was in the 50s, one of the premier scholars of the Civil War, Stanley Elkins, wrote a book entitled Slavery, which was the first really psychological study of the institution of slavery, the psychology of it, the behavior of it. Stanley Elkins, in his book on slavery, originated the term the Sambo personality. When I was a kid, there used to be a series of children's books about a little boy from Africa, and the title of the books was all about Little Black Sambo. And it created a certain image, a certain behavioral stereotype of what people expected young black children to act like and to behave like. Elkins, in his research on the institution of slavery prior to the Civil War, develops the origins of the stereotypical behavior of the good slave, the so-called Uncle Tom. The slave who knew his place, who didn't try to go beyond his raisin. What did the institution demand in order to justify itself? It demanded that slaves behave the way the stereotype said that they should behave. Whites demanded deference because they were white. Blacks were expected to defer to whites because they were not white. And beatings were administered when people did not live up to the stereotype. Stanley Elkins described this behavior of slaves as what he called the Sambo personality. That for purposes of survival, in order to avoid beatings, slaves were forced to learn to play the role and to be what their owners expected them to be. Thus, the stereotypical Sambo type, who constantly responded, "Yes, master, no, massa. Yes, missus, no, missus," stepped out of the way into the gutter in order to leave the sidewalk for their betters. And the more successful the institution of slavery was in institutionalizing this behavior, the more it was evidenced, the more reinforcement those who administered the slave system believed that it was the right system. The idea developed that this behavior that we demand from our slaves is what comes naturally to slaves. That's why they're slaves. And so consequently, we adopt in our minds the stereotypical image of the way blacks ought to behave. Tell me, without being too contemporary, in a course focused on the Constitution, at the Virtual Center, on a program focused on the Constitution, at the risk of becoming a little bit too contemporary, tell me that one of the issues we are seeing all around us in America today is that we have a president in the White House who doesn't seem to fit the office. We've got a president today who seems committed to the idea of and behaving above his raisin. In golf all the time. When in fact, maybe he ought tell that the American Revolution and the emergence of republicanism dealt a death blow to deference in American society. I don't believe it. I doubt whether you believe it either. So in spite of the intricacies and the depth of analysis that we see in the Federalist Papers, we must never forget that there are certain givens about society that really don't change. David Hume is writing about the real world in which people live on a day-to-day basis. People don't obey other people purely out of self-interest. The only way that a successful governor can govern is if people accept the fact that that person deserves to be governor. If you want me to follow your rules, somehow you've got to convince me that you have a right to make those rules. And I would argue that so much about our political and social system, previously and now, in today's America, is driven around these kinds of considerations. Do you think I'm thumbing through an excerpt here from Madison's Federalist number 10. Do you think that when James Madison talks about taking the views of the public and passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom and love of justice, this is in Federalist number 10, passing the public views through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom and love of justice makes them best able to make decisions in the public interest. And Madison goes on to say, it often happens that the public interest as defined by representatives of the people is more consonant to good than if pronounced by the people themselves. Translation: there are certain people who are born and raised to make decisions and make the rules for other people. Our job is to find a way to bring those people to the surface. Students are appalled when they read in Plato's Republic Plato's commitment to the idea of philosopher kings. The idea that there are certain people with the kind of wisdom and the kind of insight and the kind of intelligence that prepares them to be kings, to be leaders. And Plato's belief that these potential leaders of the future have a right to be educated in a certain way so that they will be prepared for the role that they will to play. People, young people, are appalled when they read that because it's so un-American. But in fact, we have in James Madison, in Federalist number 10, about the Constitution of the United States, Madison's determination that all the problems related to factions in society can be solved by a republic. Madison says, in a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. Let us examine, Madison says, the points in which it varies from pure democracy, and we shall comprehend both the nature of the cure and the efficacy which it must derive from the union. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, Madison says, first, the delegation of the government in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. And here's the quote I paraphrased before. The effect of the first difference, Madison says, is on the one hand to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, Madison says, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for that purpose. What Madison is saying in Federalist number 10 is that the Constitution of the United States is structured in such a way that while the voice of the people is necessary, the will of the people will be refined and reviewed through successive mediums. It will be filtered until the final decisions are made by the people best qualified to make them. This does not signal the end of deference politics, I would suggest to you. On the contrary, it signals the determination to perpetuate a system of deference politics of sorts. I think we must accept the realities here. This is James Madison. I just wanted to share with you that, and I'm jumbling my reading lists here. Douglas Adair this is on page 21 of Gary Wills's book. Douglas Adair sets out to establish the connection between David Hume and James Madison. And according to Adair, he finds clear evidence of Madison's borrowing from 5 different essays of David Hume. Hume's essay on the idea of a perfect commonwealth, his essay entitled Of Parties in General, his essay entitled Of the First Principles of Government, one entitled Of the Independence of Parliament, and finally, Parties of Great Britain. Basically, what Douglas Adair does is establish the links between the thinking and writing of David Hume and the writing of James Madison as reflected in the Federalist Papers. Let me give you one example. We have less than 2 minutes to go in today's program, so let me give you an example. David Hume. Opinion is of 2 kinds, to wit, opinion of interest and opinion of right. Right is of 2 kinds, right to power and right to property. That's Hume. Madison, Federalist number 10. There are 2 methods of curing the mischief of action. The one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. There are again 2 methods of removing the causes. Do you see the connection, not only in content, but in style? The extent to which Madison writes in the Federalist Papers in such a way that he points out there's a choice. There are 2 ways of doing this. And then he'll go on and say, there are 2 ways of doing the first thing. And then later on he'll come back and say, there are again two methods of addressing the second. This is a strategy, a tactic of writing, if you will, that's very, very popular in David Hume. And Madison adopts it very well in Federalist number 10. That's just one example. We've reached the end of our program today. It's 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for being with us today. We will not be here tomorrow. We'll be back on Wednesday, regular time, 1 p.m. But I have another engagement tomorrow, so I'm presuming that the folks at Head On will run one of our previous programs for tomorrow, but I'll be back on Wednesday. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for listening. Be safe.